Hi, I'm Alan Alexandroff, and I'm the Executive Director of the eJournal Global Summitry. The eJournal is now moving to a multimedia format. This is going to be the first article for the eJournal, and while we will continue to provide traditional peer-reviewed written articles, we are expanding the format to include, where appropriate, video interviews and podcasts. In just a moment, I will invite our first author into the virtual studio, our good colleague Homi Kharas of the Brookings Institution. This moderated discussion with Homi is going to focus on the evolution of sustainable development. That is, from the IDGs, the International Development Goals, to the MDGs, the Millennium Development Goals, and to the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals. And we're also going to discuss with Homi the state of what the UN calls Agenda 2030 as we reach the halfway point in the effort to achieve the SDGs. So let me now welcome Homi Kharas into the virtual studio. Well, it's my pleasure to be here today, as you can see, with my good colleague and guest author today, Homi Kharas. This is the first video interview and session with one of our authors on this special issue, which is strengthening global governance by achieving the SDGs. Homi is a senior fellow in the Center for Sustainable Development, which is housed in the Global Economy and Development Program at the Brookings Institution in Washington. Homi has studied policies and trends influencing developing countries, including aid to poor countries, the emergence of the middle class globally, and global governance in the G20 for quite a number of years. And increasingly, Homi, you've had a focus on debt management, financing investment in the lower income countries, the LICs, and the middle income countries, the MICs. Before that, and it's related to today's interview, Homi served as the lead author and executive secretary of the secretariat, supporting the high-level panel of eminent persons on the post-2015 development agenda. And ultimately a report was issued by the Secretariat and called A New Global Partnership, Eradicate Poverty and Transform Economies Through Sustainable Development. That particular report was issued in 2013, the end of May. Most recently, Homi's co-authored or edited a whole series of reports and books from Brookings, including most recently Breakthrough: The Promise of Frontier Technologies for Sustainable Development. So, Homi, the SDGs are at the halfway point. Last year's high-level panel forum, or what's called the HLPF, initiated the summit, which is going to occur on the HLPF and the SDGs. We're at the halfway point here coming up for the SDGs themselves. And of course, that includes all 17 goals and 169 targets set out in Agenda 2030 by the UN. But I want to take us back a bit and kind of get context here in terms of the evolution of the SDGs. We start out in the mid-90s. We start with what were called the IDGs, the International Development Goals, and we then see the emergence of the Millennium Development Goals, or MDGs, in 2000. So what's occurring here? We've got the IDGs, and then we get the MDGs by 2000. What did the MDGs in particular look like? But take me back to the IDGs and carry us through.
So let me start even further back and talk about children. You know, one of the real origins of all of this was the idea that there should be goals and targets for children. Children should live, they should be educated. I mean, those were two quite simple propositions that were put on the table, and neither was happening back in the 1990s. And so there was a lot of discussion about the use of quantitative targets to try to make improvements on this. And ultimately, those international development goals kind of, moved into the mainstream and were adopted as a set of Millennium Development Goals. Of course, 2000 was the millennium. And it also coincided with Jubilee 2000, where the debts of a lot of developing countries were written off. So it was as if, here we are, new millennium, new start. Let's really think about how we can make the world a better place. And let's start with the children. Mm-hmm. And so in the MDGs, what you see is a set of goals which are heavily focused on what I would call basic needs. So it's poverty and hunger and education and infant mortality and things like that. Very tangible things that in particular affected the poorest people in the poorest countries. And the MDGs have sometimes been described as a grand bargain, where the poor developing countries said, yes, we will prioritize these things. And the rich world said, and we'll give you money to support you doing this. Because we know that if you want to expand education or put in place better health systems, it's going to cost some money and, of course, reduce poverty. So it was very much a kind of a grand bargain style of things. I think it was quite successful. So in retrospect, when you look back, you can actually see a distinct change in the rate of progress in many of these things. And it's most apparent in things related to mortality. We had the establishment of new organizations and entities. We had Gavi, we had the Global Fund for AIDS, TB, and malaria. Mm-hmm. And when you look at, what these things did, they mobilized more money. Gavi, vaccinations had plateaued way before. And thanks to the introduction of Gavi, we managed to get a real uptake in the rate of vaccinations of a number of different things in developing countries. And these are the cheapest, most cost-effective ways of saving lives. Mm-hmm. Global Fund, similarly, I think a tremendous innovation. So you had institutional innovation, you had the backing of finance, and you had governments that were prepared to prioritize these things and do a lot of the on-the-ground kind of, we need these programs and the delivery mechanisms. I mean, at the end of the day, to vaccinate people, you need to have people who do the vaccinations. And so governments were also had a lot of those responsibilities. So all of this was seen as a great success of the United Nations. And as 2015 approached, there was a decision to say, okay, now what? And broadly speaking, there were two philosophies. One was most of the MDGs had been framed in terms of targets which were cut this in half, like let's cut poverty in half, let's cut hunger in half, that kind of thing. And so there was one agenda which was so-called finish the job. Let's just keep the MDGs as they are and just say, okay, we did the first half in the first 15 years. Now let's do the next half.
Yeah, go to zero.
Yeah, exactly. So that was all called, zero goals, and they were explicitly defined in that way. Then there was another school of thought that basically said, look, we had this thing, it came out of the UN, but frankly, it involved low-income countries and rich countries. And very little of it was about middle-income countries. And as we came into 2015, the number of low-income countries had really gone down, and the number of middle-income countries had really gone up. So the question was, well, do we need to say something and bring middle-income countries into this tent? And middle-income countries were concerned with a range of other sets of issues. They were concerned with innovation and, industrialization and technological progress and the urban agenda and things like that. And at the same time, there were other groups. There was a group that was very concerned with growing physical violence and conflict, and they was thought they should be brought into the tent. And then, of course, we had the Rio conferences and events that highlighted that the world needed to do something on essentially on nature, whether it was pollution or water or land. All of those were being degraded, and so the Sustainable Development Goals, as they emerged, ultimately said, actually, we need a big tent. There are lots of countries. They've got lots of different priorities. If we want to think about something new, let's try to construct a framing that will, where every country and every community can see themselves reflected in it. And there will be some priorities for each of them. And that is basically what we ended up with as the Sustainable Development Goals, these 17 goals, 169 targets. Many people say this is rambling, it's not focused, etc. All of that, I think, is nonsense. Every individual country has more than 17 ministries. And so it's like telling a country, well, you shouldn't have this many ministries because all you need to do as a government is focus on 2 or 3 things. Nobody ever does that. People know and understand that they have to focus on a range of things if they really want to, do something in support of the very diverse sets of interests of their populace.
Okay. So I take it, by the time of the SDGs emergence, which is passage of the UN General Assembly support for the SDGs in September 2015, the scope had expanded significantly beyond the MDGs, which were kind of classic development kinds of strategies, to a whole of the global system approach.
Right. Okay. That's absolutely right. And so the SDGs are called universal, whereas MDGs were very much seen as something that poor countries needed to do. I mean, the rich countries provided the money, but it was the poor countries that did the actions. Yeah. Sustainable Development Goals are universal, and most of the action, especially on, let's say, on climate change, etc., rests with advanced economies. So, it's quite a different proposition.
Okay. And so looking at those first years, you initiated in 2015, the SDGs, and maybe up until the pandemic, there's a sense that, there was some degree of success in the SDGs in that period. Would you agree with that?
So I think that the success has been in creating a language of development that has now come to be used almost universally. The SDGs are the lingua franca when you talk about development. It's now used, it's used by business, it's used by civil society organizations, it's used by governments, it's used by municipalities and subnational governments. It's used by the environmental movement. It's used by the peace movement. So all of these different groups, the humanitarian movement, all of the different groups that previously had been involved in some small part of development started to see that this all fit together in a broader framework. So if you like the old analogy about the elephant and the blind men, etc., the SDGs is the elephant. It's sort of telling everybody, here is the elephant.
Yeah.
You guys have the trunk and you have a piece of the leg and you're seeing the tail, but actually this is all an elephant. And it's good. It's allowed these people to talk to each other in a very positive way.
Okay. So we hit the pandemic, and the question becomes, Homi, has the pandemic, the COVID-19, taken some of the critical Agenda 2030 goals out of reach now?
So, look, first, I don't want to blame everything on the pandemic.
Okay.
Even before the pandemic, if you think of what was happening in the world, the new Republican administration that took office in 2016 in the US.
Oh, the Trump administration.
Yes.
Yeah.
Brexit. All of these were forces of what we now call deglobalization.
Okay.
So I think even before the pandemic, there was a certain retraction from this idea of solidarity with developing countries, of people helping other people, of a rising tide will lift all boats kind of view, towards much sharper nationalistic kind of views. And then when the pandemic hit, all of this kind of emerged in very sharp focus. And so the developing countries were extremely disappointed that they didn't get access to any of the vaccines and that the rich world sort of hoarded them all. They were very disappointed in the sort of that the rich world was able to produce literally, trillions, by some estimates, $15-16 trillion to resuscitate their own economies from the pandemic, but almost nothing to help resuscitate the rest of the world. So it kind of revealed a bit the sharp disparities in capabilities between different countries. And I think to a considerable degree, the limits of global solidarity. And that has bred somewhat of an atmosphere of distrust in the system as we see it today, that is disappointing, because the SDGs, when they were actually conceived, were conceived of at a time of great trust and hope that collaboration and solidarity amongst countries would actually take the world to a better place.
Mm-hmm. So let's add in a piece here. How much do you think the geopolitics, the kind of roaring back of geopolitics into the global system, most prominently, obviously, Russia's war in Ukraine, the rising tensions in particular between the United States and China, how much have these features of the global order at this point undermined achieving the SDGs from your perspective?
Geopolitics creates uncertainty, and uncertainty creates a flight of capital to safe havens. Developing countries are not safe havens. So that world of, easy money, remember the phrase easy for long or something like that? I mean, there had been an anticipation that the cost of capital would be low for a long time. All of those kinds of presumptions have started to change with this geopolitics. I'm not saying that the geopolitics is the only thing, but there's definitely a sense now, if you look at the big numbers and the big trends, foreign investment into developing countries has really declined. Private capital movements have declined. Aid has been shifted towards dealing with, let's say, Ukrainian refugees rather than to,
assisting others. Yeah.
So you see it in lots of different ways playing out. And ultimately, the geopolitics reduces focus on the core issues of sustainable development. And it's difficult for people to deal with so many multiple things at the same time. So development as an agenda has kind of, dropped down.
Mm-hmm.
And the SDGs ultimately were all about poverty reduction. If you start to open a conversation today that development is about poverty reduction, it almost catches people off guard. So, it's a struggle to keep some of these, terribly important issues just even on the agenda.
So let's take a quick look then here at the United States, because it was very clear that, when the SDGs were launched, when the Sustainable Development Goals were launched, there was a strong support from the United States. President Obama gave a very stirring speech at the UN, right? Looking at the SDGs and the hope for success. Yet in the recent Brookings report, you were an author, a whole series of authors from Brookings, the report called the SDG Second Half, Ideas for Doing Things Differently. But I'm thinking about the article by Sarah Mendelson and Tony Pippa in particular, and they said the U.S. government had played a critical role in shaping the agenda and in generating substantial international support. Yet the U.S. government has been mostly missing in action ever since. What happened, Homi? Given that energy and enthusiasm, and subsequently, you never hear about the SDGs from any American official. I listened not long ago to the American UN representative talking about priorities for the United States vis-a-vis the United Nations. Didn't even mention the SDGs.
Right. So, first, both Sarah and Tony know whereof they speak. Tony was one of the U.S. negotiators for the SDGs. Sarah was, at ECOSOC, and, so they're very kind of tuned in. And indeed, the U.S. played a very important role in creating the SDGs. John Podesta was on the high-level panel where I served as in the secretariat.
Right.
So, it was powerful voices and very serious voices. The U.S. had an interagency task forces set up to make sure that they would be able to deliver on the SDGs as they were finally negotiated. And there were even implementation steps. There was an SDG dashboard that was created. There was a system for generating information on the on what was happening to the SDGs in the United States that was put in place by the end of the Obama administration. Then we have a new administration. And in the new administration, the UN became what not to do and what not to support. And so I think we lost a lot of momentum. And then in this administration, some of that has been regained. There is now the previous Congress had instructed the Secretary of State to give them a report on the SDGs, using the words the SDGs, within a year. There are some administration officials who have started to actually use the words, the SDGs, but I mean, these are such small kind of almost symbolic efforts compared to what was there before, that it's clear that a lot of that is gone. And partly it's gone, Alan, because so much of the US they've become two keys to the way in which the US thinks about the developing countries. One is in terms of climate action, and one is in terms of the response to the Russia-Ukraine war. And, neither fit. Climate action, of course, is part of the SDGs.
Yes.
But the US focus is heavily on mitigation and has not yet really placed climate mitigation in the broader development architecture.
Okay.
And so when they talk about climate mitigation, it's very much as a silo in the context of, say, COP27 or the UNFCCC, rather than in the context of the SDGs. So there's been a real sort of deflation, I would say, of the momentum towards the SDGs. And the other great champion of the SDGs had been the UK. And Prime Minister Cameron at the time, when he was Prime Minister, former Prime Minister Cameron, he was one of the co-chairs of this panel that I served on. And so again, I mean, they had a really strong, focused, determined kind of impact on the SDGs. And when his government collapsed and new governments came in and they were taken up with Brexit rather than with international development, and now you see in the UK, which had always been a leader on things like overseas, official development assistance, the UK has actually cut back the amount of its foreign aid in very unfortunate ways, and so they're kind of drawing back from their leadership of this topic. So we've not had that kind of strong global leadership from countries prepared to put their money where their mouth is.
Mm-hmm. So let's look at your more relatively recent take on the SDGs in the Breakthrough Report, which was also obviously done at Brookings, and even more recently, you did a piece in that 2022 report, the second half, with Amar Bhattacharya, and you wrote, the MDB should embrace, those are the multilateral development banks, these are development institutions, should embrace and drive the new growth story for the 21st century, one based on innovation and investment in green technologies. Your recent writing on the SDGs, and there's a whole series of reports and books, had emphasized innovation and technology, as I see it, from your writings, and in terms of being able then to achieve the SDGs. The kind of the concern I have is, are you saying that achievement of the SDGs, if that were to be the possibility, is primarily through the diffusion of these new technologies? And if that's true, it requires us to kind of assess where that is and whether the effort to transform the global economy is achieving results. And if that's the case, is that having a spillover effect on the SDGs?
Right. So let me start by saying that if we don't have growth, economic growth, we will not achieve the SDGs.
Okay.
And when people say, as they are saying, that most countries are off track on most of the SDGs, which is a very sad story, one of the things they're saying, and the reason why they are making that claim, which I think is factually correct, is that growth has slowed. So
global growth,
and it's not just global; it's in every individual
country,
most individual countries.
Okay.
And when you don't have growth, you don't have domestic resources, you don't have foreign direct investment, and you don't have the multilateral banks and all the rest of it. So everything starts to just stagnate.
Mm-hmm.
So what's going to be the trigger? And for us, one of the things that we see actually is that technology has moved fast and at a pace that has surprised us, even faster than what was anticipated when the SDGs were written. Mm-hmm. And if you were to ask somebody 10 years ago, give me one magic bullet that would really spur development, If they'd been smart enough, and I wasn't at that time, they would have said, bring down the price of power, of electricity, from the 10, 15 cents per kilowatt hour, which is what we're paying in Africa, to 1.5 cents per kilowatt hour. Tenfold decline in the price of thing, because ultimately, if we can get energy, we can get development and growth. Okay. Well, guess what? That's exactly where we are today. The price of a renewable, let's say solar or offshore wind in some commercial contracts, this is not subsidized, this is in commercial contracts, is down to 1.5 to 2 cents per kilowatt hour. That's extraordinary. The problem is we can't take advantage of most of that in a developing country because the cost of capital is too high. So you only get prices at that level if your cost of capital is also at the rate, an interest rate of essentially, let's say, the US. And these contracts I'm talking about are contracts by Saudi companies. And the Saudis, of course, have a lot of money. They have essentially the global interest rate. But if you're Egypt, you're paying 20%. If you're Pakistan, you're paying 20%, or Senegal. So there, at those kinds of interest rates, renewables make no sense because they have a high upfront capital cost. It's all about the equipment.
Yeah.
So that's sort of where we are a little bit today, and why, as you said, Amar and myself have been writing that the multilateral development banks are at the heart of this process, because now what we really need is cheap, affordable, plentiful capital in order to implement these new technologies that are now available. And I've given you the example of the technologies in the power sector, but as you know, in Breakthrough, we went through a list of technologies in a number of different sectors, and it's always the same story. That in so many of these areas, there are huge new opportunities, but they always will require investment in order to move forward. And we need to basically unblock those investments. We just did, just to give you an example, I'm just working on something on finance. The share of government expenditure funded by the multilateral development banks in middle-income countries has fallen by 1/3 since 2000. No, has fallen to 1/3, fallen by 2/3 to 1/3. So we're so far away from where we were in the year 2000. So we're not even keeping pace with the way in which the world economy is expanding and growing, let alone taking advantage of these new opportunities and new investments. And that's really the, what I think we need to unblock. And then if we can do that, and to come back to that example of the Global Fund and Gavi at the time of the Millennium Development Goals, we've seen that institutional innovation can then unblock the finance and lead to really quite dramatic results on the ground. And we're hoping that that's going to be the story of the second half of the SDGs.
So if I understand you correctly, what really needed are various avenues in order to reduce the cost of capital in these, particularly these developing economies. And I don't know whether you think that's backed up by ginning up global growth as well in order to get that. Is that what you believe is necessary at this stage of the game to have any chance of achieving the SDGs?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I think that, there's always a kind of a chicken and egg between does the finance come first or the growth come first, because, finance follows success. And right. If we can get that cycle going, then we will make considerable progress with the SDGs.
Okay. And do you think, I mean, those kinds of notions are likely to filter into the summit coming up in 2023, which that's the halfway point for the for the goals of the SDGs?
Well, it's already coming up in a number of different international arena this year. This week is the week of the spring meetings of the World Bank and the IMF in Washington.
Yeah.
Secretary Yellen has been talking about this issue now in a number of different occasions. She's triggered a fresh look of the role of the World Bank, a so-called, let's make the World Bank fit for purpose for the 21st century kind of thing. So all of this, is in the air. The G20 have announced a new expert group to look at the multilateral development banks. The previous Indonesia G20 issued a report on the so-called capital adequacy frameworks of the multilateral development banks. There's a summit in Paris that President Macron and Prime Minister Mottley is going to part. They're all moving in that direction. So there's a great deal of dialogue and discussion now about unlocking this new phase and new type of finance. And if that bears fruit, then many things can happen. If it doesn't bear fruit, then I'm afraid it's going to be a very uphill struggle.
Well, I'm glad we were actually able to land on a wee bit of optimism in this very long struggle. Homi, I want to thank you for taking the time to discuss with us the road towards achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. It's great. And I must also thank you for your various roles that you've played in trying to forward the efforts to achieve the SDGs as well.
Thank you, Alan. I mean, this is in many ways, I believe, the defining agenda of our times, partly because of the urgency of action on climate. And even though, rich countries have the bulk of the responsibility for dealing with the climate countries, if you don't get developing countries on board and moving on this agenda, then the world is going to become a very difficult place for all of us. And so one of the things that I believe was always the case when we tried to make the argument that the SDGs were universal, what we were essentially saying is that this isn't just something for poor countries to do so that we can all sleep better at night knowing that a bunch of poor people are somewhat less poor. This is something in everyone's self-interest. And right now, I think what we understand and what the science is telling us is that there is interdependence in the world. And so development has suddenly moved from what I call a nice to have kind of thing, where, a bunch of people like myself would say, oh, wouldn't it be nice if we could do this? Or wouldn't it be nice if we could do that? Now it's become an imperative. If we don't do this, everyone in an advanced economy is going to feel the after effects just as surely as they do feel the after effects of things like, the war between Russia and Ukraine and other kinds of things. This is big, pervasive, and will flow into all of our lives.
Well, thanks once again, Homi. It's a really interesting and a pleasure to be with you on this.
Thanks so much for having me.